The morning sun bathed the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook in a soft golden light. Tree-lined streets bordered immaculate lawns, where the hum of sprinklers and the chirping of birds created an almost serene backdrop. This was the kind of community people dreamed of, peaceful, picturesque, and inviting, or so it seemed. Amidst the tranquility, the Wilson family arrived in a modest, moving truck, their excitement evident as they stepped out to embrace their new beginning. The Wilsons were a close-knit black family of 4. Marcus, the father, was a diligent software engineer with a quiet strength and warm demeanor. Beside him stood his wife, Angela, a high school teacher whose kindness radiated in every interaction. Their 2 children, 16-year-old Kayla, with her love for books, and 10-year-old Jamal, an aspiring basketball star, were equally thrilled about this fresh chapter. For the Wilsons, moving into Willowbrook was a dream come true. It was their chance to provide a better environment for their children, away from the chaos of the city. They had saved for years to afford their new home, a cozy single-story house nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac. As neighbors peeked out from their windows, some smiled politely, while others watched with a hint of curiosity, or something darker. Among those watching was Officer Greg Turner, a middle-aged policeman who lived just a few houses down. Greg was known for his stern personality and a reputation that divided opinions. To some, he was a dedicated enforcer of law and order. To others, he embodied something more sinister, someone quick to judge and wield his authority without question. As the Wilsons unloaded their belongings, Greg stood on his porch, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the newcomers. He didn't greet them. Instead, his gaze lingered, narrowing with suspicion. "Who are these people?" he muttered under his breath, gripping the railing tightly. For the Wilsons, this moment marked hope and opportunity. But for Greg, it ignited an unsettling discomfort, born from preconceived notions and a bias he didn't bother to hide. In his mind, this family didn't belong in Willowbrook. Not here, not in his neighborhood. It was only a matter of time before this tension would boil over into something far more confrontational, something that would change their lives forever. The Wilsons were settling into their new home, their laughter and conversation drifting into the warm afternoon air. Kayla and Jamal had started unpacking boxes in the front yard, arranging books and toys on the porch, while Marcus and Angela worked together to assemble a patio set. The neighborhood seemed calm, but a storm was brewing, unnoticed. Greg Turner had been watching them since morning. The sight of the moving truck and the cheerful family irritated him in ways he couldn't fully explain, or wouldn't admit. As the day progressed, his unease morphed into a simmering anger, fueled by his own biases. By mid-afternoon, he decided to act. Greg approached the Wilsons with heavy, deliberate steps. His uniform, though off-duty, lent an air of authority, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely faced consequences. As he crossed the street, his presence drew the attention of a few neighbors, who peeked out of their windows or paused their gardening to watch. "Hey!" Greg's voice boomed, startling everyone. Marcus looked up from the patio table, confusion clouding his face. Angela instinctively stepped closer to her children, sensing something was off. "Yes? Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his tone polite but cautious. "What's going on here?" Greg demanded, his eyes darting between the family members and the moving truck. "This truck's been here all day, and I don't recognize you. Are you even supposed to be here?" Marcus furrowed his brow, taken aback by the accusatory tone. "We're moving in. This is our home," he replied, gesturing toward the house. Greg crossed his arms, his face hardening. "Your home, huh? Got proof of that? Deed? Lease agreement? Or are you just squatting here?" Angela stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, officer. We've just bought this house. We don't need to explain ourselves to you." Greg scoffed, his demeanor growing more hostile. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I don't take kindly to people like you sneaking into this neighborhood." "People like us?" Angela asked, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You know what I mean," Greg shot back, his words laced with a thinly veiled menace. The children clung to their mother, fear evident in their wide eyes. Kayla, usually quick-witted, was rendered speechless, while Jamal buried his face in Angela's side. Marcus clenched his fists, struggling to maintain composure. His instinct was to protect his family, but he knew that escalating the situation could make things worse. "You're out of line," Marcus said, his voice steady but tight with controlled anger. "You're harassing us for no reason. We haven't done anything wrong." Greg smirked, taking a step closer. "Is that so? Because I could call for backup right now, and we'll see if you've got a record. Maybe there's a warrant out for you. You sure you want to go down this road?" By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of several neighbors. Some stood on their porches, arms crossed, watching silently. A young woman walking her dog stopped nearby, pulling out her phone to record the scene. Greg noticed the onlookers but didn't seem to care. Or perhaps he was too far gone in his misplaced authority to stop. Angela's voice cracked as she spoke. "Please, leave us alone. We're just trying to move into our home. We've done nothing to deserve this." Greg leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Here's a piece of advice. Pack up your truck and leave. People like you don't last long around here." Before Marcus could respond, a voice from the crowd broke the tension. "That's enough, Greg." It was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor who had lived in Willowbrook for decades. She stepped forward, her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "Leave them alone. They're not bothering anyone." Greg turned to her, his expression faltering for the first time. "Stay out of this, Helen." "No," she shot back, her voice unwavering. "I've seen enough. You're embarrassing yourself and this neighborhood." The murmurs of the other neighbors grew louder, and a few more began recording with their phones. Greg's bravado wavered under the weight of their scrutiny, but his anger didn't subside. "Fine," he muttered, backing away. "But don't think this is over." As Greg retreated to his house, the Wilsons stood in stunned silence. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Angela hugged her children tightly, while Marcus exchanged a grateful nod with Mrs. Henderson. But the incident wasn't over. It was only the beginning of a chain of events that would shift the power dynamics in a way Greg Turner could never have anticipated. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over Willowbrook as the Wilsons tried to settle into their new home. But the day's events lingered like a storm cloud, especially for Marcus and Angela. While the children watched TV to distract themselves, Marcus paced the living room, his jaw tight with frustration. "This isn't right, Angie," he said, stopping abruptly. "We didn't move here to be treated like criminals." Angela, ever the voice of reason, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know. But we can't let him scare us away. This is our home now." As Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening, Angela reached for her phone. "It's time we remind him that he's not above the law." Unknown to Greg Turner, Angela Wilson was no ordinary high school teacher. Before stepping into education, she had spent years as a civil rights attorney, specializing in cases of police misconduct. She had left that chapter of her career behind to focus on family and community, but the skills, and the fire, were still there. If Greg thought his badge made him untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. The following day, Angela got to work. She contacted an old colleague from her legal days, who agreed to assist in preparing a formal complaint against Greg. Meanwhile, Marcus combed through the footage captured by bystanders during the confrontation. The young woman walking her dog, identified as Samantha, had already uploaded her video to social media, where it quickly gained traction. Within hours, local news outlets picked up the story, amplifying the outrage. As the public outcry grew, so did the scrutiny on Greg Turner. Journalists began digging into his background, and what they uncovered was damning. Greg was already on thin ice with the police department due to multiple complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. He had narrowly escaped suspension twice, thanks to union protections and lack of evidence in prior cases. But this time was different. The Wilsons weren't just another family afraid to stand up for themselves. Angela's legal expertise, combined with the video evidence, created a case too strong to ignore. The department had no choice but to open an internal investigation. As Greg's name made headlines, more cracks in his life began to surface. The neighbors who once tolerated his behavior started speaking out, recounting instances of intimidation and abuse of power. Financial troubles also came to light. Greg was drowning in debt due to a failed business venture, and his house had been on the brink of foreclosure for months. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Greg, who had so smugly threatened the Wilsons, was now fighting to keep his own life from unraveling. Angela and her legal team filed a lawsuit against Greg and the police department, citing harassment, intimidation, and violation of the family's civil rights. The evidence was overwhelming, and the case quickly gained momentum. The court of public opinion was also firmly on the Wilsons' side, thanks to the viral video and Angela's eloquent interviews with the press. During the proceedings, Greg's actions were laid bare. Angela's sharp questioning left him fumbling for answers, his bravado replaced by desperation. "You claimed they didn't belong in the neighborhood," Angela said, her voice steady but cutting. "On what grounds? Was it their skin color? Their moving truck? Or was it simply because you thought you could get away with it?" Greg stammered, unable to provide a coherent response. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his guilt palpable. As the case concluded, the judge ruled in favor of the Wilsons. Greg was ordered to pay a substantial settlement for damages, but with his financial troubles, it was impossible. His house, valued at far more than he could afford to lose, was seized and put up for auction. In a poetic turn of events, the Wilsons purchased the house. The irony was not lost on the community. The very man who tried to intimidate them out of the neighborhood had, through his own actions, handed them a symbol of justice. The Wilsons decided not to live in Greg's house. Instead, they converted it into a community resource center focused on combating racial injustice and promoting inclusivity. The center became a beacon of hope in Willowbrook, attracting volunteers and activists from across the city. As for Greg, he resigned from the police force under mounting pressure. His reputation was in shambles, and his once comfortable life had been reduced to rubble. The Wilsons' resilience and intelligence had turned the tables, showing that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never out of reach. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers eager to witness what had become the most talked-about case in Willowbrook's history. The Wilson family sat together, a united front of strength and determination. Angela, now fully embracing her former role as a civil rights attorney, took her place at the plaintiff's table alongside her legal team. On the opposite side sat Greg Turner, visibly tense and out of his depth, accompanied by his attorney. The proceedings began with Angela's team presenting the facts of the case. The viral video played on a large screen, showing Greg's aggressive confrontation with the Wilsons. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the footage captured his threats and the thinly veiled racism in his words. Angela, calm but piercing, laid out a timeline of Greg's actions, connecting his harassment of her family to a pattern of behavior that had plagued his career. "Officer Turner has a history of abusing his power," Angela stated, addressing the judge and jury. "He has faced multiple complaints of misconduct, all swept under the rug until now. This time, there is no escaping accountability." Greg's attorney tried to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding, claiming Greg acted out of concern for the safety of the neighborhood. But Angela's cross-examination quickly dismantled that narrative. "Concern for safety?" Angela questioned, her tone sharp. "Did you ask any other neighbors for proof of ownership? Or was it only my family that drew your suspicion? What about the lack of any evidence suggesting wrongdoing? Greg fumbled with his responses, beads of sweat forming on his brow. His confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the realization that he was cornered. The witnesses, including Samantha and Mrs. Henderson, delivered damning testimonies that further eroded Greg's defense. Mrs. Henderson's words were particularly impactful. Greg Turner has always acted like the rules don't apply to him. What he did to the Wilsons wasn't just wrong, it was cruel. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision. Greg Turner was guilty of harassment and misconduct. The court ordered him to pay substantial damages to the Wilsons, and the police department faced public pressure to implement reforms. Greg's unraveling was on full display. As the judge announced the verdict, he slumped in his chair, his face a mask of defeat. His reputation was in ruins, his financial troubles now insurmountable, and his career effectively over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the Wilsons for their reaction. Angela, standing beside Marcus and her children, spoke with quiet dignity. "This isn't just about us," she said. "It's about ensuring no one else has to go through what we endured. Justice has been served, but the fight for equality continues." The public's support for the Wilsons only grew. Greg's actions had not just cost him his job and home. They had ignited a movement, with people rallying against the abuses of power that his case exemplified. The Wilsons, now seen as symbols of resilience and hope, had turned the tide in a fight they never asked for, but were determined to win. With the legal battle behind them, the Wilson family finally exhaled the weight they had been carrying since the day of the confrontation. They had stood their ground, faced an unjust system head-on, and emerged victorious. But for Angela and Marcus, the victory wasn't just personal. It was an opportunity to make a lasting impact. The irony of owning Greg Turner's house wasn't lost on them. The sprawling two-story home stood as a symbol of the justice they had fought for, but instead of moving in, the Wilsons chose to turn the space into something greater. After careful deliberation, they decided to convert the house into the Willowbrook Center for Justice and Equality. The center would serve as a hub for community outreach, offering legal assistance, education programs, and workshops on combating racial bias and promoting inclusivity. Angela led the initiative, drawing on her legal expertise and network of allies to bring the project to life. "This house represents more than just a legal victory," she said during the center's opening ceremony. "It represents change. A reminder that when we stand together, we can dismantle prejudice and build something stronger." The center quickly became a cornerstone of the community. It hosted events ranging from town hall meetings to youth mentoring programs, and its library of resources empowered countless individuals to stand up for their rights. Angela's story of resilience resonated far beyond Willowbrook, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring towns. The case had sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Greg Turner's downfall served as a cautionary tale about the misuse of authority, while the Wilsons' triumph highlighted the power of perseverance and justice. For many in Willowbrook, the incident sparked difficult but necessary conversations about implicit bias and systemic racism. Neighboring families, some of whom had initially been skeptical of the Wilsons, now reached out to express their support. "We didn't see what was happening until it was right in front of us," one neighbor admitted during a town hall meeting. "The Wilsons opened our eyes." The police department also faced intense scrutiny. Under public pressure, they introduced new accountability measures, including body cameras for all officers and mandatory bias training. While these changes were a step forward, Angela knew the fight for equality was far from over. "Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey," she often reminded those she worked with. The Wilsons continued to thrive, balancing their roles as advocates and a loving family. Kayla and Jamal, once shaken by the incident, grew into confident young leaders, inspired by their parents' courage. Marcus returned to his work as an engineer, though he often volunteered at the center alongside Angela, mentoring youth in STEM fields. In the end, the family's story became more than just a headline. It was a powerful reminder of what can be achieved when courage meets conviction and when the voiceless refuse to stay silent. As Angela stood on the steps of the community center one evening, watching children play in the yard and families gather for a workshop, she felt a sense of peace. "This isn't just our victory," she said, looking at Marcus. "It's a victory for everyone who believes in justice, equality, and the power of standing together." The camera pans out, capturing the vibrant life of the community center against the backdrop of a setting sun. The Wilsons' story, though rooted in pain, ends with a message of hope, that even in the face of prejudice and injustice, change is possible. All it takes is the courage to fight for it.